I want to talk about the four facets of Rabbi Lamm as I saw them, and as I think many other people in our community saw them. Rabbi Lamm is sorely missed and has been missed for a few years, really, as he declined recently, because Rabbi Lamm was what I call the full package. What do I mean by that? Rabbi Lamm was a stellar scholar. We're going to spend the next 10 classes talking about different aspects of Rabbi Lamm's scholarship. But Rabbi Lamm was a stellar scholar who wrote dozens of articles and many books. And he did so even while he was busy and even while he was a university president. Most university presidents, if they remain scholars, they turn into bad university presidents. And if they become excellent university presidents, they stop being scholars. Not Rabbi Lamm. Rabbi Lamm led yeshiva through what reasonably could be called a golden age. Financially very successful, academically stellar, physically well-managed, religiously powerful. And Rabbi Lamm did it while remaining a scholar. Second of all, Rabbi Lamm was a deeply important religious leader. He role modeled a vision of modern orthodoxy that both worked and was religiously powerful. We'll discuss later on in one of our later classes the details of Rabbi Lamm's vision of Torah Umada, but whatever exactly the details were, we'll discuss it at great length. Rabbi Lamm role modeled it and built a model of what I'll call modern orthodoxy l'chadchila. There was no sense that we were a dormant or secondary community or a way station for people becoming more religious or less religious. Rabbi Lamm was a stellar religious leader in a time of modern Orthodox growth. Rabbi Lamm was a communal leader. He was the founder of many institutions. Some institutions are hardly connected to him at some level, which is he founded Camp Morashah. He was the first rabbi of Camp Morashah. He founded Tradition. He was the president of Yeshiva University and never hesitated to establish new and novel things. Rabbi Lamm wasn't just a communal leader. He was a communal visionary. He could look at what wasn't there and imagine how much more it could be if we built something new there. Many communal leaders can only imagine adding a third floor to the two-story building, but they can't imagine what a new building could do, or even what a new baseball field could do. Rabbi Lamm was a true communal leader because he looked at what we had and said, what else do we need? And he incessantly built things. Finally, and perhaps most importantly to me, Rabbi Lamm was a compromising leader. And I say this in the most flattering way. We live in a highly polarized time where everybody appeals only to their base and seeks to build more fanatical leadership, less caring about the other. Rabbi Lamm understood not just political compromise. Rabbi Lamm understood the many different sides of a complex issue. And when you asked him to shape a policy, he frequently shaped a policy that synthesized the dialectic tension of two competing visions. And thus, he was frequently pillared as a compromise, but I never found that pillory to be accurate. Rabbi Lamm intuited that if there was a group of people who were screaming out, the correct answer is blue, and another group of people screaming out that the correct answer was red, really the correct answer was a mixture of blue and red, or blue stripes and red stripes, or blue circles and red dots. And that if lots of smart people looked at a problem and intuited two answers, true wisdom lied in putting both of these answers together. And of course, Rabbi Lamm knew that he would always be accused of never being pure, because the people who believed blue was the right answer would scream out, look at the red. And the people who saw red as the right answer would scream out, look at the blue. But Rabbi Lamm was deeply confident in the following idea. When many smart people over many different times have looked at a hard problem and have put forward two or three answers, each of which makes a claim of unique truth. Actually, the true truth is the combination special that is at some level intellectually incoherent, and at another level is intellectually the most honest. If very smart people have looked at a Jewish law matter and divided into three camps, the winning solution is the one that accommodates all three camps. It's not the one that proves definitively that this view is correct and the others are incorrect. Many years ago, Rabbi Lamm said to me directly that the idea that a dispute between Rambam and Tosfos can be intellectually resolved to prove the Rambam either right or wrong, or Tosfos either right or wrong, is rarely correct. And the winning approach, rabbinically, is to harmonize two competing answers in many different ways. And Rabbi Lamm was pillared throughout his many years of leadership because he was a compromiser, and Rabbi Lamm relished the criticism, and he honestly thought that the strongest intellectual positions were the intellectual positions that didn't rest on the unique correctness of your view, but acknowledged the correctness of the other view as well. And Rabbi Lamm liked that approach. He liked being in the group that believed in the truth of compromise. Compromise in Rabbi Lamm's model didn't come from doubt. It came from faith. And it came from the realization that God created an exceedingly complex world in which truth was not always a single answer. Rabbi Lamm used to say in many different settings that it was rare that truth was mathematically precise. He believed in the truth of compromise. And he knew that he lived in an era where that was an unpopular position and people tended to be uncompromising. And he was committed to being a compromiser because he thought that the truth of the position resided in the middle of the two extremes. I saw many times the overlap between his view and the approach of Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, and it always impressed me very much that the two of them recognized the same basic idea, which is competing visions should be harmonized. And even if you produce a somewhat inconsistent view, because you're not a purist, because the purist says my view is correct and all other views are wrong, you're probably closer to the bullseye and giving a more accurate read of the truth by being a compromiser. Of course, Rabbi Lamm was much more than the four values of scholarship: religious leader, communal leader, and compromiser. It's become clear over the past years talking to his family, that he was a wonderful father. Raising children in the limelight is not easy. Going back to Rabbeinu Gershon, we have the tradition that the children of Gedolim sometimes come out very bad. And Rabbi Lamm was a masterful father, raising children while he was in the limelight and they felt normal and proper. And furthermore, I saw many times from Rabbi Lamm's relationship with his wife, Melinda, how close they were. I want to share with you just a personal story, but then we'll go on to talk substance. I was once talking to Rabbi Lamm about my wife, Chana. We've been married for many years at this point, since 1985, or 35 years. And I remarked to Rabbi Lamm that when I first approached Chana to date, she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date anybody but me. And it took a little bit of perseverance to persuade her to date me. And after we were dating, it took a little perseverance to persuade her to marry me, and that we should get married sooner rather than later. And it's obvious why, because everybody knows that my failings are obvious. My failings are widely reported on the internet, and my failings were obvious even to her. And Rabbi Lamm looked at me and he told me it's no vice. Mrs. Lamm, that's what he called his wife, didn't want to date him either. And he remembers calling her up to go out on the first date in the 1950s, early 1950s, and he called her from his parents' home phone, and he was nervous, he said, and he picked up the phone and he asked to speak to her, and he asked her if she would go out on a date with him, and she said, "1 second, please," and she put her hand on the phone and said to her mother, "I don't want to date him." And her mother turned to her and said, "You must date him. Our grandfather knows his grandfather, and his grandfather is an eminent Torah scholar. You must date him." So she went on one date with him begrudgingly, feeling that her mother told her she had to, and it was a wonderful date, and they had a good time, and got married. And Rabbi Lamm said to me, "There's nothing to be embarrassed about marrying somebody who didn't want to date you the first time." And that then he turned to me and gave me a bracha that I feel like I've lived up to, which is, he said, "You, Michael, should be as blessed in your marriage as he, Rabbi Lamm, was in his own." Well, so that's a eulogy for now. I'm going to open each one of these classes with words of eulogy because I miss Rabbi Lamm terribly. But I want to spend much of my time focusing on Rabbi Lamm's scholarship. And each week I want to focus on one of his articles. And I just want to start by focusing on what I think is Rabbi Lamm's earliest profound piece of scholarship, which is in 1956, Rabbi Lamm published in Judaism the Fifth Amendment and its equivalent in Halacha, focusing on confessions from a Jewish view. This was in an era where it was an active conversation in American law as to whether forced confessions should be admitted and what that exactly meant. And Rabbi Lamm's article was cited not once, but twice by the United States Supreme Court. The first in the very, very, very famous Miranda decision. Rabbi Lamm and Jewish law play a role. And he's cited by Chief Justice Earl Warren in the Miranda opinion itself. As Rabbi Lamm said once, me and Maimonides are both cited by Chief Justice Warren. He thought that was funny. And Rabbi Lamm is cited again by the Supreme Court in Garrity versus New Jersey. To the best of my knowledge, although Jewish law has been cited frequently by the United States Supreme Court since then, The citation to Rabbi Lamm and Maimonides and Miranda is the first citation to Jewish law in the United States Supreme Court, and it is a classic. And the reason why it's a classic is because Rabbi Lamm's article is a classical Rabbi Lamm article. He seeks to explain the halachic view on self-incrimination and contrast it with the American model. Rabbi Lamm opens with a basic recitation of the Jewish law. Halacha does not permit self-incrimination on criminal matters ever. Ever. And Jewish law never permits a defendant to confess to a crime and be punished for the crime. The confessions of a defendant are inadmissible, to use a technical American term. And Rabbi Lamm points out that it's inadmissible no matter what. It's inadmissible even when the defendant confesses in a way that indicates that his confession or her confession is true. It's inadmissible even when the defendant confesses in a way that self-verifies. It's simply inadmissible. The prosecution has to prove its case in the Jewish tradition, independent of the testimony of the defendant. You can't call the defendant to the stand, and you can't ask the defendant to testify under any circumstances. Rabbi Lamm is not the first to note this in any way, shape, or form, and the article is not novel for its observation of what Jewish law is. The article, however, is quite novel and original for its explanation of why Jewish law adopts this view. And Rabbi Lamm introduces us in his opening recitation to a basic idea that Rabbi Lamm admires very much, and which he uses in a few other of his articles. And indeed, I'm going to demonstrate in the course of these 10 classes. It's a theme of Rabbi Lamm's scholarship. Rabbi Lamm quotes the Radvaz, Rabbi David ibn Zimra, for the following idea. The reason why a confession is inadmissible is because our body does not belong to God, the Radvaz says, and if we allow a person to confess, we would allow him to be punished based on his ownership. And the Radvaz contrasts this very elegantly and nicely with commercial matters. When I go to David Blumenthal, who I'm picking on because he's first on my Zoom list, in the order that you're sitting in, he's on my, on the front row. And I say to David Blumenthal, David, I owe you $10,000. And David knows I don't owe him $10,000. But I say, David, yes, I owe you $10,000. And I hereby acknowledge my debt to you of $10,000. And I hand him a written piece of paper which says, I owe David Blumenthal $10,000. That note is enforceable in Jewish law, even though I subsequently claim it's false. And we can even show mathematically, scientifically that's false, because I write as follows. On January 1st, I met with David Blumenthal and I borrowed $10,000 from him. And we can show on January 1st, I was in Poland and David Blumenthal was in Atlanta. Nonetheless, this debt is enforceable. And the Radvaz says a basic explanation for why. The basic explanation for why is because my money belongs to me. And I can dispose of my money any way I want, including creating liability when none exists. This explains why in the Jewish tradition, I can buy a Porsche and decide what I really want to do is saw the Porsche in half. Since I own it, it's my property, I'm entitled to destroy it. The Radvaz's point is as follows. That makes perfect sense for my money. And not only that, that makes perfect sense for my hair. I can trim my hair when I want, and I can trim my nails when I want, and I can control many aspects of my body as if they're my property. If I want to grow a beard, I grow a beard. If I want to be clean shaven, I'm clean shaven. These are my autonomy rights. But the Radvaz's point goes as follows. When I want to kill myself, the Jewish tradition says I may not. And so too, the Jewish tradition says I may not jeopardize any aspect of my body to physical punishment. Not only can't I confess to a death penalty offense, I can't even confess to a whipping offense because I don't own my body. And since I don't own my body, I lack the basic autonomy rights to step into court and confess to a sin that generates physical punishment. Rabbi Lamm will come back to this theme many different times in many different settings. I will call it here by a term Rabbi Lamm doesn't directly use, but he implicitly uses. I'm going to call that the Kedusha theme. People are endowed with innate holiness. The innate holiness prevents them from doing things with their body that autonomy might permit them to do, but holiness prevents them from doing. This is not true with your money. Your money is a possession. And since your money is a possession, it lacks any innate holiness, and you're allowed to do with it as you see fit. But when it comes to matters of Kedusha, I lack the right to impinge on the holiness God gave me. Rabbi Lamm will use this to explain matters of sexuality. He'll use this to explain matters of environmentalism. He'll use it on a few different levels, but he uses it first here to explain why a person is not allowed to confess to judgment on a criminal matter. Confessing to judgment on a criminal matter, Rabbi Lamm says, is tantamount in the Radvaz's vision to professing ownership of your own body. And if we allow people to profess ownership of his own body, we deny a basic religious idea, which is that we are holy human beings and parts of what we do are sacred. Our financial life is not sacred. Our financial life is driven by principles of ownership, but our physical life is driven by principles of holiness. And by principles of holiness, we are precluded from confessing to criminal activity. And then Rabbi Lamm goes on and highlights a second approach, which he calls the Rambam's approach, and indeed it is the Rambam's approach. The Rambam is very out of character here. Normally the Rambam tells you the rule, and it's unusual that the Rambam speculates as to why there should be this rule. The Rambam never tells you the reasons for many different Torah rules. Rambam doesn't use the Mishnah Torah as a place to give you reasons for commandments. But yet here, the Rambam uses the Mishnah Torah to explain to you a reason. I'll read it to you in English, just for the sake of convenience. The Rambam notes the Sanhedrin, the court, is not authorized to inflict either the death penalty or whipping based on an admission by the accused. Now I'm going to quote it in translation in English. For it is possible that he was confused in mind when he made the confession. Perhaps he was one of those who are in misery, bitter in soul, who long for death, thrust the sword into their bellies, or cast themselves down from the roofs. Perhaps this was the reason that prompted him to confess to a crime that he had not committed in order that he might be put to death. The Rambam takes the Radvaz's rationale. Really, the Radvaz is after the Rambam, but the Radvaz gives a different reason. But the Rambam says as follows. People are suicidal, and they falsely confess to crimes. And when you ask them why they falsely confess to crimes, they say as follows. The Rambam says, there are people in this world who yearn to die and who are despondent in life, who will not kill themselves, but who will falsely confess to a crime in order to put themselves either to death, or others read the Rambam as to say, in the limelight. They so rarely have their moment in the limelight, they will use the opportunity to step forward simply to get their moment on the front page of the New York Post. And the Rambam says to us, these confessions are inherently
wrong
and not reliable
and might not be true.
and not true and self-destructive, and let me use an even broader term. They are distracting to the determination of who really did the crime. And if you talk to police officers or detectives, or even you just watch detective shows, you see the moment a hideous crime occurs in New York and they open up a tip line, you know what happens?
You get hundreds of false claims.
Hundreds of false confessions. The lonely people call up and say, I did it. Send a policeman over to talk to me and I'll explain to them how I did it.
They get the reward. So.
And maybe they get a reward. That's right. It's Rabbi Lamm's point is that if you examine what the Rambam says and you talk to contemporary police officers, you see the Rambam is exceedingly correct in his read of reality, which is when the police are walking around with a spotlight, shining it on criminals to determine if they commit a crime, large numbers of despondent people say, oh, there's a spotlight over there. Nobody ever shines the spotlight on me. You know what I need?
A spotlight.
A spotlight. And I need to step forward. Tal goes even further, Tal Moskowitz, and makes reference to the term suicide by cop. which of course is one of the things the Rambam means, which is people who want to die do things that cause the government to want to kill them, even though if you stopped and readily examined, you would see that they're totally not guilty. I saw a statistic which says as follows: about a third of the people who are shot by police officers are carrying a toy gun, which they point at a police officer, hoping that the police officer will kill them. The Rambam hits upon a basic truth, which is if you walk around with a spotlight screaming out, who will do this? Who will look at me? Let's shine the spotlight. Lots of people scream out, "Ooh, a spotlight? I need a spotlight." And they step into the sun and they examine the reality around them. And Rabbi Lamm, between these two tools, the Radvaz's idea that we don't own our body, and the Rambam's idea that self-confession is inherently unreliable because the heartless, cold murderers among us, you know what they don't do? Confess.
Kill themselves.
They don't confess. The people who run Dial M for murder and who kill people for money and who do other heinous crimes, they're very good at not getting caught. The people who confess are clearly troubled and difficult and less likely to be guilty than we might honestly acknowledge. Rabbi Lamm then does something which moves me very much and reminds me how good a scholar he is. Rabbi Lamm then uses this data to make the following observation about American law, and he sharpens it in his elaborated version of this essay. This essay, published in 1956, is republished 20 years later as a chapter in his wonderful work, Faith and Doubt, by which point the American law is well settled. The American law by 1976 is well settled in a middle position. The middle position is confessions are admissible if voluntary. And Rabbi Lamm notes there how inelegant this approach is and how prone the American model is to instability. Rabbi Lamm says as follows: the model of the common law was that all confessions were admissible and they were tested to determine if they were accurate. If you confessed in America in 1850 to a crime, the judge said, it's nice that you confessed, but you have to undergo what they call a colloquy with me, in which you present to me enough evidence that I believe your confession. So you have to know pieces of information that only the criminal would know. And many people in 1850 who confessed to crimes were acquitted because the judge was aware of the Rambam's rule. And if you confessed to a crime that you didn't have evidence that you committed, the judge exonerated you because he knew that you were in the formulation of the Rambam, one of these people who was despondent and self-destructive, and you didn't really commit the crime. And the only time confessions are admitted in the common law is when they can prove to be accurate. The classic example of this is where I confess to a crime and I share information that only the person who committed the crime would know. Classic example of this is from a 1970s case involving a man who kidnapped a child and buried her alive with a limited air supply, and nobody knows where the child is. And what do the police do?
Ask him where the child is.
They wheedle it out of him. I don't want to discuss the details, but from the fact that he knows where the child is buried is pretty good indication that he was what?
The perpetrator.
The perpetrator. But Rabbi Lamm, by 1970, realizes that American law isn't heading in this direction. It's heading into a unique place, which is you can confess to a crime in American law and based solely on your guilty plea with no supporting evidence at all, be found guilty. And Rabbi Lamm steps out of his rabbinic model to criticize in a very thoughtful way the compromise grounds of American law. Rabbi Lamm realizes that in the Jewish tradition, if you confess to a crime, the prosecutors might listen to your confession and use that to collect witnesses against you and prove you guilty. It's not that the prosecutors didn't listen to your confession. It's that your confession was inadmissible. But if you said to the prosecutors, I murdered Joe in front of Harry and Tommy, they went to Harry and Tommy and they said, did you see Michael kill Joe? And then they would call Harry and Tommy as witnesses. My confession, while inadmissible, could be listened to and traced to determine if supporting evidence can be found. American law, Rabbi Lamm points out, does the worst of both worlds. It doesn't require any supporting evidence of a guilty plea, while simultaneously not requiring the prosecutors engage in self-examination to suppress the confession, i.e. to determine if the confession is realistic. By promoting the compromise, which is confessions are admissible if they're voluntary and only inadmissible if they're involuntary, Rabbi Lamm puts forward that American law has entered a period of dramatic intellectual instability. It has stopped the police abuse of beating you with a hose to get a confession out of you. But Rabbi Lamm's point is that it's easy to prove that confessions beaten out of you with a hose are inadmissible because actually I confess to nothing that the police don't already know. Here's a sad truth. If you tied Michael Broyde to a chair and beat him, he would confess to the killing of Lincoln. I have a low threshold for pain. And if you said to me, confess to the killing of Lincoln or we will continue to beat you with a hose, I would confess to the killing of Lincoln. And if you asked me details, I would tell you everything I could find on Wikipedia. But I don't actually know anything about the killing of Lincoln, and I couldn't pass the threshold of confessing new and novel information. Rabbi Lamm's point is that if American law wants to get rid of involuntary coerced confessions, a better way to do that is to subject confessions to a rigorous European analysis to determine if the confessor has bona fide information. And if it wants to worry about the Lonely Hearts confessions of the Rambam or the Radvaz's idea that our body is owned by God, it hasn't done so. And it's put itself in an extremely vulnerable position in which lots of people will closely follow the newspaper, collect enough public information to put forward a bona fide confession, and will be found guilty of crimes that they didn't do. And Rabbi Lamm's observation of this in the 1970s was prescient, because the Innocence Project has shown us an interesting thing. Not only are there many people out there who protested their innocence and were innocent, there were lots of people out there who confessed to rapes And yet, when genetic evidence came forward, it turns out they didn't do it. Wasn't them. And Rabbi Lamm's point is that there are a network of guilty people out there who feel bad. And when they hear of a terrible crime, they read the newspapers closely. They collect enough information to put forward a bona fide confession because they read all that's out there. And then they confess based on publicly available facts, and they are innocent. Rabbi Lamm assumes that will continue in American law and that this is a failure of American law. And let me tell you what Rabbi Lamm does in 1975. He hits the nail right on the head. Rabbi Lamm's prediction for what's wrong with American law is stably prescient. By acknowledging that the middle position that American law has come to unstably permits people who want to plead guilty, Rabbi Lamm picks up failure of American law, which he firmly ascribes to the Rambam. And he notes that American law has left itself profoundly vulnerable to the Rambam's sad, lonely, bitter people who follow along. And in something that's even more prescient, Rabbi Lamm observes in the newspaper world of the 1970s, this will become even more common. And of course, if Rabbi Lamm had been a part of the deep intellectual world of the last 5 years, he really stopped being part of the deep intellectual world that we're in 3 or 4 years ago. He would have said in the era of YouTube and 24-hour news nonstop, it brings out the lonely hearts even more and even more impressively. And this is a very important observation that Rabbi Lamm makes. The United States Supreme Court realizes this many years later, and they start imposing a duty upon a judge to make sure that a person who's pleading guilty off of a confession has made a bona fide guilty plea based on the facts. But the Supreme Court doesn't go far enough, and they don't require what the Rambam requires, which is an adequate and independent knowledge that this person has committed this crime. What the Rambam wants is what the Jewish tradition really directs, and which Rabbi Lamm thinks really American law should require, which is nobody should be found guilty of a criminal offense unless there is adequate and independent evidence that this person has committed the crime, even if you remove as admissible their own confession. Now, again, I want to be honest with you because Rabbi Lamm is honest. The defendant's confession can be examined by the prosecutor and used to collect evidence, but that doesn't make it admissible. That just means it's an evidentiary data point that you can look at to collect verifiable evidence. This is an extremely important, ever so practical observation. And American law precisely falls guilty to Rabbi Lamm's prescient prediction of what will happen, which is the lonely hearts among us will incessantly plead guilty to crimes that they did not commit because they see a spotlight and they run towards it. And I'll add further something that Rabbi Lamm hints at in one of his footnotes, but doesn't exactly say. The guilty people, the Machiavellian plotters and planners who commit crimes for a living and who think things through intensely, you know what they are?
Smart.
And never going to confess. They're going to instead find some lonely heart who they'll feed information to, who will confess for them. And we know this is exactly true. The incessant people who regularly, without remorse, commit crimes, they don't confess. And the confession process does nothing to enhance the accuracy of the criminal justice system. Rabbi Lamm's call that American law should insist that everybody who pleads guilty to a criminal offense should be adequately and independently vetted to verify that they are guilty of this crime is correct. He hits the nail on the head in his prediction of American law. It's not the only time Rabbi Lamm used his Jewish perch to successfully critique American society. We'll see a few of them. He wasn't only a critic of American society, he sometimes used his perch as a successful American to critique the Jewish society, and we'll come to that as well. But Rabbi Lamm, by dint of occupying a place comfortably in two worlds, Rabbi Lamm didn't straddle both worlds. He lived successfully and dynamically in both worlds. He managed to grab the best of each of these worlds and bring them into conversation one with another. In his article on confessions, he brings the American model to task in light of the Jewish tradition. In other articles we'll examine, he gently critiques the Jewish tradition in light of Western Enlightenment. And that's worthwhile as well. Rabbi Lamm was a gentle, successful critiquer. And because of that, when his criticisms hit directly on the head, it's worth saying, wow, this man was prescient. In 1956, he presciently saw what was going to become the problem in American law. And in 1976, he doubled down on that prescient prediction quite correctly.
Did he have a law degree?
No, he had a PhD in Jewish philosophy. Rabbi Lamm was the only doctoral dissertation Rabbi Soloveitchik supervised. Rabbi Soloveitchik supervised exactly one PhD in his whole life, and it was Rabbi Lamm's. And that was not an accident. It wasn't like Rabbi Lamm said, I'll randomly supervise somebody's PhD dissertation. It can be you, Rabbi Lamm. It wasn't like that way. Rabbi Lamm was the leading disciple of Rabbi Soloveitchik for many years, and the Robb graciously agreed to supervise his excellent dissertation. He had no law degree at all, but he was a man that widely read. And he was a physicist by training, a chemistry major in college, who went to Brooklyn Poly for a master's degree. He was multivariated and exceptionally well-read, a thoughtful thinker in many disciplines.
Did he supervise anybody else's PhD?
Rabbi Soloveitchik? No.
No, Rabbi Lamm.
As far as I know, no.
Can we come back to the question of why adequate and independent evidence is not sufficient?
Adequate and independent evidence might very well be sufficient, but it can't be a confession.
Well, but the question is, did the Rambam think that in principle there never could be adequate and independent evidence, and therefore self-confession was inadmissible?
No, adequate and independent evidence means I confess that I killed Joe in front of Tommy and Harry. And because I confess that I killed Joe in front of Tommy and Harry, the prosecutors will go to Tommy and Harry. They're only aware of Tommy and Harry because I gave them Tommy and Harry's name, and Tommy and Harry will testify that I killed Joe. That's adequate and independent, meaning my confession might lead them to evidence, but my confession is inadmissible.
So according to the Rambam, then, if the two witnesses affirm it, then I am guilty in spite of my confession.
Of course, meaning you can't avoid punishment by confessing. That would be extra good, to avoid punishment by confessing. No, that you can't do.
What about the case of the woman who is accused of adultery?
The Sota ritual is a totally different matter because it's not a crime at all. It's a divine intervention. Absent God, it doesn't work. I love to be subject to divine ordeals, because God doesn't act on them. The Sota ritual doesn't work if God doesn't consciously violate the rules of nature. This is the difference between the Jewish ordeal and the Christian ordeal. The Christian said, we think you're a witch, and we'll weigh you down with rocks and throw you into the water, and if you're not a witch, God will save you. But it's also possible that I'm not a witch and God will not save me. Whereas in the Jewish tradition, a divine ordeal is we do something harmless to you, which if God thinks you're guilty, will punish you. Different model.
Okay.
Any other questions? We're going to spend the next 9 classes reviewing different aspects of Rabbi Lamm's theology.
I understand that the Supreme Court position that adequate and independent evidence is actually in concordance with the view of the Rambam.
No, the Supreme Court requires that the person who confesses recite facts that would make him guilty. That's not adequate and independent.
Why, if they're verifiable, is that not adequate and independent?
Because what we've learned in America is the police feed you these facts or they're publicly available. Meaning Michael Broyde can give you lots of facts about Lincoln's assassination, widely available on Wikipedia. And I could easily confess to a judge to killing Nixon because I could tell him all the things he needed to know, what kind of gun I was carrying,
But if I tell you,
and what play was watched, and all of these are adequate and independent, but they can be determined by many other people.
But if I tell you where the victim is buried and you don't know, and then you confirm it,
right? Even that is very hard to know because maybe I'm just a conspirator.
I say,
Maybe I'm just a conspirator.
so what constitutes adequate and independent evidence?
We'll reach out privately to talk about that. That's a good question. That's an excellent question. That's actually a dissertation by Rabbi Nachum Rackover from many years ago. Not for now.
Okay.
Now is the time to pay tribute to Rabbi Lamm and his thought process. I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to comment and people who can log on physically and see how everybody's doing. Okay, good to see you all. Next week we'll meet at 6 o'clock. And I posted a list of 10 topics that we're going to deal with. Rabbi Lamm's memory should be a blessing to us all.